Now, in the past few days, the Islamic State group has claimed responsibility for a knife attack in the French capital, as well as multiple bombings in Indonesia carried out by families. The violence comes in the run-up to the holy month of Ramadan, a time the jihadists have typically called for more attacks to be carried out. To talk more about ISIS, I'm joined by Rukmini Callimachi, correspondent for the New York Times, who tracks the Islamic State group. Thank you very much for joining us here on France 24.
My pleasure. Good to be here.
Now, the Islamic State group's hopes of creating a caliphate have all but been destroyed. How is it that this group still inspires people to carry out attacks?
Well, you have to understand that this is a group that was here long before their territorial caliphate, and it's most likely going to be one that is here for much after the destruction of its territorial caliphate. This was an insurgency that began in Iraq in 2003. It held smaller pieces of ground up until 2014 when it took over an area the size of Great Britain. It has now been pushed back from most of that territory. It does still hold territory at the Iraq-Syria border. And clearly, its capacity is not completely tied to the land that it holds.
Now, you recently wrote the ISIS files for the New York Times, where you got a hold of some 15,000 documents which detail how the terrorist group was able to run a state effectively. Did that surprise you?
It didn't completely surprise me because I've been studying this group for a while. I knew that this is a group like Al-Qaeda that has a voluminous bureaucracy, which comes with voluminous paperwork. What did surprise me is how many of the misconceptions about ISIS we were able to dispel. For example, I believe your listeners and your viewers have heard of the idea that ISIS made most of its money from oil. That is simply not true. There were reports that were done as early as 2014 and 2015 indicating that oil was no more than 20% of the Iraqi and Syrian-based caliphate's economy. The records I found confirmed that it was indeed taxation, and within taxation, it was specifically agriculture that was the bulk of their economy. That was something that was interesting for me.
Now, the ISIS files have received some sort of criticism, you could say. People say that Iraq's history has been removed from the country, but you say you've received the necessary permissions to take the documents out. That's right.
The thing to keep in mind is that my team and I were always embedded with Iraqi troops wherever we went. This area was under the control of the Iraqi military when we went there because it was on the front lines that we gathered these documents. We not only recovered these documents, we actually saved them because the reason that the Iraqi officials who were with us allowed us to take the records is because they themselves were in the process of burning them. They were destroying them. So there isn't a reality in which these documents would somehow have ended up in the hands of Iraqi historians or the Iraqi National Archive. The only reality is that they would have been destroyed and forgotten had the New York Times not put in an enormous amount of time to recover them and to preserve them.
It was a fascinating read indeed. Now, you have a podcast out called Caliphate. Now, one of the people you talk to is a former ISIS fighter. His nom de guerre is Abu Huzaifa, I believe. He's a Canadian national of Pakistani origin. And you asked him what attracted him to jihad. And he's not a disgruntled youth. This is something that surprised me. He seems to have grown up in a middle-class family over in Canada and seems to have gotten attracted to fight jihad because he was simply bored.
You know, that's not uncommon. I think we have this idea that these people joined this group because they were bloodthirsty criminals. In fact, when you go to meet them, and at this point I've interviewed between 2 and 3 dozen of these ISIS fighters in person and more over the internet, what you find is that many of them actually joined this group out of what you would call idealistic reasons. For instance, in Abu Huzaifa's case, he was incredibly upset about the images that were coming out of Syria of the barrel bombings, the chemical attacks, images that are upsetting for all of us to see. But what ISIS is able to do is they're able to funnel these people into a pathway where there is an action that they can take. You are feeling pain because your brothers and sisters in Syria are being hurt. here is what you can do. You can join the Caliphate, you can come and protect them. And this is actually a through line that I've seen with many recruits, that they went there initially out of what they thought were humanitarian reasons.
Rukmini, we're going to have to leave it there. Rukmini Callimachi joining us from the New York Times. Thank you very much for speaking to us here on France 24.